Today we turn to a very different topic altogether. I want to look at today at millenarian movements in early 16th century Germany, and specifically at the Great German Peasant Uprising of 1525. And what I would like to do is, as I have been doing throughout all these lectures, is to put this phenomena within a specific social, economic, and cultural context. And in this case, in this particular case, in a religious context. One of the things that I'm going to try to deal with in this lecture, and later on when I talk about the wish craze, is to look at the linking of religion, and in this case millenarian beliefs, with political agitation, and the kind of results that are brought out because of this. When we get to Germany in the early 16th century, we see also very important economic and social changes. There is growing pressure on the peasantry. The kind of destruction, or should we say the evolution of the village community, which I discussed very briefly in lectures 2 and 3, now come to fruition in the early 16th century. There is growing social distinctions within the village, there is growing pressure upon the land, and there is a movement of enclosure, which in a sense sends the peasants out of the land, or which makes the peasants who have until then had access to the commons, had some kind of property in which they could cultivate certain of the produces and grain, and now they are becoming landless peasants, that is to say, members of a kind of agrarian proletariat. The enclosure movement, which is of course found also in England and in other parts of Europe as well, is one that puts a great deal of burden, a great deal of pressure on the peasantry. Together with that, there is a kind of an economic crisis that makes the lords squeeze the peasants harder for income. That is to say, the lords are caught into a changing economic conditions, and one of the things they try to do is to impose greater financial burdens on the peasantry. So in a sense, there is all kinds of transformations that are taking place in Germany, which are of great importance in serving as context not only for the peasant uprising, but also for the great German Reformation. The other important aspect, of course, is a religious change, and that is ushered in by Martin Luther, who in a sense transformed the entire world of Europe in the early 16th century. I cannot even begin to emphasize the importance of the Reformation in a sense unleashing. It's a great watermark that unleashes all kinds of social and economic and cultural changes. And you have to see the German peasant uprising and the radical Anabaptist beliefs, the kind of millenarian expectations of these peasants within the context of the Reformation. What is the Reformation, and who was Martin Luther? Martin Luther was born in 1483 in Saxony. He was essentially destined for a life as a jurist, as a lawyer. Later in life, when he was in his late teens, he was caught in a lightning storm in an open field. He was terrorized and terrified by this. He promised to become a monk if he would survive. This took place in 1505, and he joined the Augustinian order. It is very significant that he joined the Augustinian order because, of course, this is an order based upon the teachings of Augustine of Hippo, who emphasized predestination over free will. He came to, in a sense, through a series of personal crises, the great crisis in the choir, he came to question the beliefs of the Catholic Church. The Reformation was not about the selling of indulgences. It was not about the power of Rome. The Reformation, the great Protestant Reformation, which is a veritable revolution, was about other things, about a way of conceiving religion, of conceiving the church very differently from the way in which the church was in the early 16th century. In the early 16th century, the Catholic Church had become extraordinarily corrupt. There is a great deal of movement within the church itself for reformation, that is to say, for a reform of a church. It is emblematic of this church of the early 16th century is the great power of the popes in Rome, the great luxury of the palaces, the patronage of the arts, their involvement in the material world. But it is not just that Luther combats in his 95 Theses or in his later pronouncements. Luther has a very different way of looking at Christianity. This is not a lecture about Luther, so I will not essentially spend a great deal of time talking to you about these things, but I want to emphasize a few points. One, the emphasis of Luther on the priesthood of all believers, meaning by this that every Christian was to read the scriptures himself or herself and determine essentially what was the truth in the scriptures. In a sense, the priesthood of all believers removed the priesthood clergymen as intermediaries between the sacred and humans. All Christians, all believers are to, in a sense, take the scriptures into their hands, read it, and therefore interpret it according to their conscience. This is a revolutionary idea, which in a sense is a way in which Luther believed he was returning to the very early and pristine church of the first 2 centuries of Christianity. Luther also emphasized the importance of reading the Bible, and therefore one of the things that he undertakes right away was a translation of the Bible into German, which becomes in fact a literary language because of Luther's translation, and this translation makes the Bible available to all the believers in the vernacular and forces them essentially to read. Luther also denies the efficacy and importance of the sacraments. Of the 7 sacraments which have been seen by the Catholic Church as the ways leading to salvation, Luther retains only 2. First, baptism, and second, communion. But communion now for Luther does not involve transubstantiation. This is a tremendous break because it is a break against a dogma of the Church, and we have learned in the previous lectures about heresy and what dogmas are. And this is essentially saying that what happens when the priest elevates or when the pastor elevates the host is not that it becomes the flesh of Christ and that the wine does not become the blood of Christ, but that this is a symbolic remembrance of the Last Supper in Jesus' last days on earth. So in a sense, the priesthood of all believers, the abolition of sacraments, the fact that Luther himself marries, the ending of priestly celibacy, the attack against transubstantiation, and far more important, the idea that we are saved not by good deeds, but by faith alone, or by faith and good deeds, which is a position of the Catholic Church, but that in fact no one deserves to be saved, that it is God in His great wisdom that has chosen to save some people and not others. That in a sense, although Luther will not emphasize predestination as much as Calvin will do, nonetheless, Luther will argue that we are saved only to the grace of God, not by good deeds, not yes necessarily by faith. That God has decided before the beginnings of time who will be saved and who will be damned. Clearly, this is a tremendous break. This is a theological break, not just on the questions of indulgences and German money going all the way to Rome, but this is a theological break with the basic tenets, the basic dogmas of the Catholic Church. Complicating the situation is the fact that in 1519, in 1520, the young king of the Iberian kingdoms, the young king of Spain, Charles I, becomes Holy Roman Emperor as Charles V. And he throws something into the political equation. Charles V is a man who, unlike all previous emperors of the so-called Holy Roman Empire, has behind him a great deal of power. He has not only the fabled Castilian armies, which by the 1520s are the best armies in Europe, he also has, after 1521, the extraordinary resources of the New World, all the bullion, the gold, but mostly the silver from Guanajuato and Potosí. Therefore, he is a political player in ways in which no other emperor before him has been. He has a great deal of power, and he can exert his authority in Germany in ways in which no one else has done until now. This raises all kinds of questions, which also explains why the German princes, many German princes, supported Luther in his conflict against the Catholic Church.